You really thought you could just disappear into the shadows of this estate? Elias's voice is a jagged blade in the calculating quiet of the corridor. I didn't disappear, Elias. I started over. You better tell your boss to keep walking before this gets ugly for everyone involved. He isn't just my boss, and it's already past ugly for you. Take your hands off her. I won't offer you a second warning. This is private property. Leave. It's not private. She's mine. This has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me. Let go of me. Sloane's voice is low, steady, and wrapped in disciplined anger, but the marks on her skin tell a story of hollow grief. Elias has her pinned against the cold marble of the East Wing like he still holds the hospital noose around her neck. Like 12,000 kilometers of ocean and a Tuesday morning escape changed nothing. Like she is still the woman who lived in a state of shrinking whenever he walked through the door. But she stopped being that woman the moment she chose unburdened vigilance over one more night of terror. You thought you could hide? His grip tightens on her arm, pulling back the sleeve of her dark maid's uniform to reveal the anatomy of a lie. Run all the way to Seoul? Elias, let go. Or what? His fingers dig into the fatal detail of the bruises on her shoulder. You have nobody in this city. You're just a maid in a big house. You never had nobody but me, and you know it. Every word is a precision instrument of psychological abuse, aimed at the places where her nerve endings still remember the pain. 3 years made him a master of clinical sabotage. He doesn't realize that the calculating quiet of the hallway has shifted. He doesn't see the shadow behind the curtain moving forward with lethal calm. Elias thinks he is the predator, but Caspin, the Iron Architect, Moon is already performing an audit of the situation. The absolute threat has just met an absolute finality. If you're ready for a story about immovable grace, the sweetest revenge, and a woman who finally finds home and solace, then you're in the right place. The fog in London that Tuesday morning wasn't just weather. It was a hospital noose of gray, damp air that felt like it was physically tightening around Sloane's throat. It was the kind of morning where the world stayed muffled, perfect for the anatomy of a lie she had been rehearsing for months. As she stood in the narrow entryway of the flat she shared with Elias Thorne, the calculating quiet of the house felt predatory. Every floorboard that didn't creak was a small victory. Every breath she held was a paper gamble against a man whose precision instrument of a mind could detect a change in the wind. She looked back once, her waitress's eye taking in the fatal detail of the living room, a shattered vase Elias had thrown 2 nights ago, the grit and grease of a life spent in primal desperation, and the heavy, suffocating shadow behind the curtain that his presence cast over her soul. She wasn't just leaving a man, she was escaping a status collapse of her own humanity. She reached for the heavy iron handle of the front door, her fingers trembling with a deep, agonizing crack of fear. The click of the latch was the loudest sound she had ever heard. It was an absolute finality. Stepping onto the pavement, Sloane felt the icy malice of the London chill, but it was nothing compared to the coldness she was leaving behind. She walked toward the tube station, her iron forged, resolve pushing her through the shades of gray in the morning light. She carried only a single bag, the weight of it a sovereign reminder that she was stripping herself down to nothing so she could eventually become everything. By the time she reached Heathrow, the hospital noose had begun to loosen. She sat at the terminal, watching the planes ascend into the chilling pale gray sky. To anyone else, the 12,000 kilometers to Seoul was a daunting distance, but to Sloane, it was a necessary physical ascent. She wasn't running toward a job or a future. She was choosing an ocean over one more night of survival. She was choosing invisibility by design. In a city where no one knew her name, where her sleeves and scars could remain a secret, and where the name Elias Thorne would eventually become nothing more than a shattered icon of a previous life. As the wheels of the plane left the tarmac, Sloane closed her eyes and heard the phantom voice of Master Kalen, a legacy of grace she hadn't yet fully embraced. Mastery is not domination but control. In that moment, she took her first unburdened breath. She had performed a clinical sabotage on her own captivity. She didn't know then that the absolute threat would follow her, or that she would one day find an iron shield in a man named Caspian Moon. All she knew was that the London door was shut, the ocean was wide, and for the first time in 3 years, she was the one holding the anatomy of power. The Moon estate was not a home. It was a cathedral of icy malice, a structure of glass and obsidian that felt as though it had been designed to dwarf the human soul. Here, the air was always a few degrees cooler than the humid Seoul streets, filtered through high-end ventilation systems that carried the faint, sterile scent of white lilies and expensive floor wax. Sloane moved through the vast, calculating quiet of the hallways with the mastery of control she had spent months perfecting. Her black maid's uniform was crisp, the fabric heavy enough to ensure that the anatomy of a lie etched into her shoulders remained hidden from the trained eyes that patrolled the corridors. To the other staff, she was solace, a woman of few words and minimized presence. She had learned to walk without the floorboards acknowledging her weight, to breathe without disturbing the chandeliered glow of the grand foyer. She was invisible by design, a ghost in a house of shadows. Every morning, she performed a clinical sabotage of her own identity, tucking her hair into a tight, severe bun and lowering her gaze until all she saw were the reflections of marble beneath her feet. This was her sanctuary, a life where the precision instrument of a man's rage couldn't reach her, or so she told herself. Caspian Moon, the Iron Architect, was the sun around which this cold universe revolved. He was a man of lethal calm, often seen as a mere shadow behind the curtain in the upper balconies of the estate. Sloane's interactions with him were rare, defined by a rhythmic tension that she worked hard to neutralize. When she served him tea in the library, a room that smelled of old leather and icy malice, she ensured her movements were a legacy of grace. She would set the porcelain cup down with a calculating quiet that didn't rattle the saucer, her waitress's eye noting the fatal detail of his posture without ever meeting his chilling pale gray gaze. Sometimes, she felt his eyes on her, an audit of the situation that made the nerve endings in her neck prickle. It was in those moments that the hospital noose of her past felt most tangible, a phantom pressure that reminded her she was still a vulnerable giant pretending to be a mouse. She would hear Master Kalen's voice then, a sovereign whisper in the back of her mind. Restraint is not the absence of power, but the management of it. She would adjust her long sleeves, ensuring the cuffs were buttoned tight against her wrists, and retreat back into the shades of gray of the service wing. In this cathedral, her invisibility was her armor. She believed that as long as she stayed in the shadows, as long as she maintained her unburdened vigilance, the absolute threat of London could never find her. She didn't realize that the very walls of the estate were already vibrating with a new kind of slow-burn tension, or that the Iron Architect had already begun to notice the deep, agonizing crack in her performance. She was a master of hiding, but Caspian was a master of the anatomy of power, and he was starting to realize that his newest maid was carrying a shattered icon of a life that was far too heavy for a ghost to bear. The calculating quiet of the Moon estate was designed to be impenetrable, a fortress of icy malice that kept the chaos of the world at bay. But for those like Iris, who operated as the signals within the house, the silence was starting to feel brittle. Iris was a woman of vigilance, her eyes trained to catch the fatal detail that others missed, a misplaced shadow, a lingering car, a frequency that didn't belong. While Sloane maintained her mastery of control in the West Wing, Iris was at the security monitors in the staff hub, watching the feed of the perimeter gates. The chilling pale gray light of the monitors reflected in Iris's eyes as she zoomed in on a figure standing across the rain-slicked street. It was a man who didn't fit the anatomy of power of the neighborhood. He wore a dark, heavy coat that seemed to absorb the streetlights, his posture a mix of primal desperation and predatory patience. He wasn't looking at the architecture, he was looking at the service entrance. He was looking for a shattered icon he thought he still owned. Iris felt a deep, agonizing crack in her professional composure. She didn't know the name Elias Thorne yet, but she recognized the absolute threat he represented. He moved like a precision instrument of malice, his presence a clinical sabotage of the peace Sloane had fought so hard to build. Iris pulled up the digital signals on her tablet, cross-referencing the man's image with the estate's visitor logs. Nothing. He was a ghost, a shadow behind the curtain that had traveled 12,000 kilometers to reclaim a victim. She found Sloane in the Grand Conservatory, polishing the silver with a rhythmic tension that was almost hypnotic. The glass walls of the conservatory acted as a chandeliered altar to the storm brewing outside. Sloane's invisibility by design was perfect. She looked like a simple maid lost in her work, but Iris saw the disciplined anger in the way her fingers gripped the polishing cloth. "There's a ghost at the gate, Solace," Iris whispered, her voice a low vibration that barely disturbed the calculating quiet. Sloane didn't stop her movements, but her breath hitched, a fatal detail that confirmed Iris's fears. The hospital noose of her past was no longer a phantom. It was a physical reality standing at the threshold of her sanctuary. "Does the architect know?" Sloane asked, her voice steady but carrying a trace of hollow grief. "Not yet," Iris replied, her eyes scanning the dark garden outside. "But the signals are flashing. He's been there for an hour."
"He knows you're inside, Sloane."
"He's performing an audit of the entrance every time the gate opens." The slow-burn tension in the conservatory intensified. Sloane looked out at the rain, her wide-eyed exhaustion returning for a fleeting second before her iron-forged resolve took over. She adjusted her long sleeves, the fabric a familiar shield against the anatomy of a lie Elias wanted to drag her back into. She realized then that her Tuesday morning escape was only the beginning of the physical ascent. The absolute threat had arrived, and the cathedral of icy malice was about to become a battlefield. She would have to trust in the Iron Architect or face the status collapse of her new life. As Iris watched, Sloane set down the silver, her posture shifting into a state of unburdened vigilance. The ghost at the gate thought he was coming for a maid, but he was about to encounter the immovable grace of a woman who had finally decided that the ocean was no longer wide enough to hide her. The corridor in the East Wing was a stretch of calculating quiet, a path of polished marble and chilling pale gray, light that felt as narrow as a hospital noose the moment Sloane turned the corner. She hadn't reached the service stairs when the air shifted. The scent of rain and cheap tobacco, the grit and grease of her London life, pierced the sterile fragrance of the estate. Elias Thorne didn't emerge from the shadows. He was the shadow. He moved with a lethal calm that mimicked the world she now inhabited, a precision instrument of a man who had finally tracked his shattered icon to her hiding place. "You thought you could just disappear on me?" Elias's voice was a low vibration that seemed to rattle the very foundations of the cathedral of icy malice. Sloane stopped. Her iron-forged resolve didn't allow her to flinch, but the primal desperation she thought she had left in the ocean began to leak into her lungs. "I already did, Elias." He was on her in a heartbeat, pinning her wrist against the cold wall. It was a familiar status collapse, a physical reminder that he still believed he owned her. "Run all the way to Korea." "For what?" "To scrub floors for a man who doesn't even know your name?" His fingers dug harder into her jaw, forcing her to face the absolute threat she had spent 3 years running from. "You don't know anybody in this city. You have nobody but me. Take your hands off her." The voice didn't come from the hallway. It seemed to come from the estate itself. Caspian Moon stepped out of the shades of gray, near the library doors. He didn't rush. He moved with the immovable grace of a man who performed an audit of a situation before he ever spoke. His presence was a sovereign intervention that turned the air to ice. Elias didn't let go. He tightened his grip, a clinical sabotage of Sloane's dignity. "This has nothing to do with you, boss. Walk away." "It has everything to do with me," Caspian replied, his chilling pale gray eyes fixed on Elias with absolute finality. He stepped into the light, his bespoke suit absorbing the glow of the chandeliers. You are trespassing in a house that does not recognize your authority. And you are marking a woman who is under my iron shield. Caspian's gaze dropped to Sloane's arm. In the struggle, the cuff of her dark maid's uniform had been torn, the fabric pulling back to reveal the anatomy of a lie. The marks were there, not fresh, but deep, fatal details of a 3-year war. They were the deep, agonizing crack in her invisibility by design. Caspian reached out, his hand moving with a lethal calm that made Elias freeze. He didn't strike. He gently pulled the sleeve further back, exposing the full extent of the scars. The calculating quiet of the hallway became deafening. Caspian's expression didn't shift into anger. It shifted into icy malice, the kind of coldness that precedes a reckoning. He looked from the scars to Elias, his trained eye identifying every precision instrument of abuse Elias had ever used. "You really thought she was alone?" Caspian whispered, the words carrying a slow-burn tension that made the air vibrate. He placed his hand on Sloane's shoulder, a gesture of sovereign protection that finally broke Elias's grip. "You believed she was a nobody because she wore a uniform. But in this city, she is the one who holds the anatomy of power, and you are just a ghost I am about to exorcise." Sloane exhaled, an unburdened breath that felt like the first one she had taken in years. The hospital noose hadn't just loosened, it had been cut. As Caspian stood between her and her past, his posture an iron shield, Sloane realized that her Tuesday morning escape hadn't ended at Heathrow. It ended here, in a corridor of icy malice, as the Iron Architect prepared to initiate a clinical sabotage that would ensure Elias Thorne never saw the sun rise over Seoul again. The calculating quiet of the estate did not return after the confrontation in the hallway. Instead, it transformed into a pressurized, strategic silence. Caspian Moon did not resort to the primal desperation of a street brawl to handle Elias Thorne. He was the Iron Architect, and his methods were built on the clinical sabotage of a man's entire existence. While Sloane was ushered into the safety of the East Wing by Iris, Caspian retreated to the Cathedral of Icy Malice that was his private study. He didn't need to raise his voice to initiate a reckoning, he only needed to move the pieces on the board. Elias Thorne had entered Seoul believing he was a predator in a city of shades of gray, but he had failed to perform an audit of the situation. Within an hour of the corridor confrontation, the shadow behind the curtain, Caspian's elite digital and physical intelligence network had mapped every fatal detail of Elias's life. They didn't just find his hotel, they found the grit and grease of his bank accounts, his forged travel documents, and the hospital noose of debts he had left behind in London. The sabotage was surgical. It began with the signals, the digital threads that connected Elias to the world. His credit cards were flagged for absolute threat patterns, his passport was voided by a sovereign ghost in the immigration database, and the burner phone he used to stalk Sloane became a tracking beacon for Caspian's wolves. Elias thought he was hiding in the neon-lit crowded streets of Myeongdong, but he was actually walking through a theater of cruelty, where every exit was being systematically welded shut. Caspian watched the live feeds from his desk, his chilling pale gray, eyes devoid of empathy. He wasn't just protecting a maid, he was erasing a precision instrument of abuse that had dared to mark what belonged to the Moon estate. A man like Thorne survives on the belief that he is untouchable, Caspian murmured to the shadow behind the curtain standing in the corner. Remove his floorboards. Let him feel the status collapse of a man who has lost his grip on the world. By midnight, Elias was a shattered icon of his former arrogance. He found himself locked out of his room, his funds evaporated into a deep, agonizing crack of banking errors, and the local authorities, prompted by signals they couldn't ignore, were performing a citywide audit for a dangerous foreigner fitting his exact description. The absolute finality of his situation was starting to settle in. Every time he turned a corner, he saw the lethal calm of men in bespoke dark suits watching him from the shadows. He was no longer the hunter. He was a vulnerable giant caught in a web of icy malice. Back in the estate, Sloane stood at her window, watching the rain wash over the cathedral of icy malice. She felt the slow-burn tension of the city vibrating through the glass. She knew Caspian was working. She could sense the anatomy of power shifting around her. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to hide her sleeves and scars. She knew that somewhere out there, in the chilling pale gray light of the city, the Iron Architect was performing a clinical sabotage that would ensure her Tuesday morning escape was finally, permanently complete. Elias Thorne had come to Seoul to tighten the noose, but he was about to find out that in Caspian Moon City, the only thing waiting for him was the absolute finality of a man who had run out of places to hide. The neon pulse of the Gangnam district provided a chandeliered glow that felt far removed from the calculating quiet of the Moon Estate, but for Elias Thorne, the city had become a cage. He stood on a crowded street corner, the grit and grease of a panicked night coating his skin. His funds were gone, his signals were dead, and the hospital noose he had once used to control Sloan was now tightening around his own neck. He felt the primal desperation of a man who had realized too late that he had performed a clinical sabotage of his own survival. Then, the crowd seemed to part with a rhythmic, absolute finality. The Caspian Moon stepped into the light. He wasn't flanked by a small army. He didn't need one. His lethal calm acted as an iron shield that pushed the rest of the world into the shades of gray at the periphery. He looked at Elias not as a rival, but as an audit of the heart might look at a shattered icon with a cold, detached indifference. "You've been running for 3 hours, Elias," Caspian said, his voice a low vibration that cut through the city's roar. "But you've been walking toward this reckoning for 3 years." Elias tried to summon the precision instrument of his old arrogance, but his voice was a deep, agonizing crack of its former self. "You think you can protect her? She's a ghost. She's nothing without the marks I gave her." Caspian moved then, a shadow's reflex that was too fast for the human eye to track. He didn't strike Elias. He simply stepped into his personal space, a sovereign presence that forced a total status collapse of Elias's posture. Caspian reached out and gripped the front of Elias's coat, the fabric bunching under his iron-forged hand. "The marks you gave her are the fatal detail that signed your death warrant," Caspian whispered, his chilling pale gray eyes boring into Elias with icy malice. "You called her a nobody. You believed her invisibility by design was a weakness. But in this city, she is the only thing that matters, and you are just a break-line perishment in the history of this house." Elias's knees hit the pavement, a visceral status collapse in front of 100 indifferent witnesses. He looked up at the Iron Architect and saw the absolute finality of his future. There was no theater of cruelty here, only the clinical sabotage of a predator who had finally been outclassed by a sovereign force. Caspian leaned in closer, his voice an absolute finality that Elias would hear in his nightmares, assuming he lived long enough to have them. "You will leave this city tonight. You will return to the holes you crawled out of in London, and you will never utter her name again. If you so much as dream of her, the shadow behind the curtain will find you. I have already liquidated your identity. You are now truly the nobody you claimed she was." Caspian let go, and Elias collapsed further, a vulnerable giant reduced to grit and grease on a Seoul sidewalk. Caspian didn't look back as he walked toward his waiting car. He had provided the iron shield, but he knew the reckoning wasn't truly over until Sloane stood in her own immovable grace. As the car pulled away, Caspian checked his watch with lethal calm. The anatomy of a lie was being dismantled piece by piece, and the Iron Architect was satisfied with the progress of the audit. The calculating quiet of the estate's outer perimeter was a world of shades of gray, where the manicured gardens met the grit and grease of the city's edge. Sloane stood by the secondary gate, the rain having tapered off into a chilling pale gray mist that clung to her dark maid's uniform. She had come here not out of primal desperation, but for a final audit of the heart. Elias Thorne was there, a shattered icon of the man who had once held the hospital noose around her neck. He looked smaller now, his status collapse complete, waiting for the unmarked car that would carry him to the airport and out of her life forever. When Elias saw her, the precision instrument of his malice flickered one last time. "You think you're safe because of him?" he spat, his voice a deep, agonizing crack against the silence. "He's just another cage, Sloane. Eventually, he'll find the anatomy of a lie you're hiding, and he'll break you just like I did." For a heartbeat, the shadow's reflex surged within her. Sloane felt the ruthless urge to bridge the gap between them, to use the strike positions she had practiced in the grit and grease of Master Kalen's dojo and silence Elias's voice once and for all. It would be an absolute finality, a clinical sabotage of the ghost that haunted her dreams. But then, the chandeliered altar of her memory opened. She heard Master Kalen's voice, a sovereign vibration that seemed to calm the slow-burn tension in her blood. Mastery is not the ability to ruin another, Solace. It is the strength to remain iron-forged when the fire is at its hottest. Choose restraint over ruin, or you will carry his ghost into every room you enter. Sloane took an unburdened breath. She didn't step forward. She didn't clench her fists. She simply stood in her immovable grace, her posture a legacy of grace that Elias could never comprehend. "You didn't break me, Elias," she said, her voice a low, steady signals check of her own soul. "You only taught me the anatomy of power. You taught me that a man who needs to make others small is the smallest man of all. Caspian Moon didn't give me this strength. He only provided the iron shield, while I remembered I already had it." She reached out and adjusted the sleeve of her uniform, no longer hiding the fatal detail of her scars, but acknowledging them as part of her physical ascent. "I don't hate you," she continued, her chilling pale gray eyes fixed on him with absolute finality. "Hate is a tether, and I am finally cutting the line. You are a break-line parachment in my story, Elias. Nothing more." Elias opened his mouth to retort, but the words died in the calculating quiet. He saw the lethal calm in her eyes and realized that the vulnerable giant was gone. She was Solace, now not just a name, but a state of being. The car pulled up, its headlights cutting through the shades of gray. Elias entered it without another word, his primal desperation finally silenced by her mastery of control. Sloane watched the taillights disappear into the soul night. She had chosen restraint over ruin, and in doing so, she had performed the ultimate clinical sabotage on his influence. She turned back toward the cathedral of icy malice, her iron-forged posture silhouetted against the estate's lights. She was no longer running from the hospital noose. She was walking toward her iron coronation, a woman who had finally learned that her invisibility by design was a choice, but her power was a sovereign truth. The car that carried Elias Thorne away from the gates of the Moon Estate was not a sanctuary. It was a hospital noose, made of leather and tinted glass. As the vehicle moved through the neon-drenched arteries of Seoul, Elias felt the primal desperation of a man who had finally realized he was no longer the architect of his own fate. Every signals check he attempted on his burner phone returned a cold, digital silence, a clinical sabotage of his last remaining connections to the world. He was a shattered icon of the predator who had landed at Incheon only days ago, now reduced to a frantic pulse and a cold sweat. He looked out the rear window, his waitress's eye for exits now blinded by terror. Behind him, a single black sedan maintained a lethal calm distance, its headlights acting as the chilling pale gray eyes of Caspian Moon. It didn't matter how many lanes the driver swerved through. The shadow behind the curtain was always there, an absolute finality that Elias could not outrun. He realized then that Caspian hadn't just kicked him out of the city. He had performed an audit of the situation that left Elias with nowhere to land. The driver pulled up to a side entrance of the airport, the grit and grease of the loading docks providing a grim backdrop for his departure. "Get out," the driver stated, his voice an absolute finality that brooked no argument. Elias stumbled onto the pavement, his status collapse so complete that he nearly fell. He reached for his passport, the only paper gamble he had left, but as he opened it, he saw a dark, vertical line drawn through his photo. It was a fatal detail from Caspian's network. He was a man without a name, a vulnerable giant whose identity had been liquidated by the Iron Architect. You have 1 hour to board a flight to a destination that doesn't exist on your map, a voice whispered from the shades of gray near the terminal entrance. It was one of Caspian's wolves, his presence a sovereign reminder that the Iron Shield extended even here. If you are still on Korean soil when the sun rises, the clinical sabotage will become a permanent reckoning. Elias didn't look back. He ran. He ran through the chandeliered glow of the terminal, his primal desperation, drawing looks of indignation from the midnight travelers. He felt the deep, agonizing crack of his own ego shattering with every step. For 3 years, he had made Sloane feel like she had nobody. Now, as he disappeared into the calculating quiet of the boarding gate, he realized the truth of his own words. He was the one with nobody. He was the one running for his life. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Elias pressed his forehead against the cold window, watching the lights of Seoul retreat into a chilling pale gray blur. He had come to find a victim, but he had found a master instead. The anatomy of a lie was over, and as the wheels left the tarmac, the absolute threat was finally, irrevocably purged. Back at the estate, the Iron Architect watched the flight's signal vanish from the radar with a lethal calm. The audit was closed. Elias Thorne was no longer a variable in the equation. The calculating quiet of the Moon estate had shifted, no longer a pressurized silence of icy malice, but a profound, resonant peace. The morning light that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows was a chandeliered glow of gold and honey, illuminating a world that had finally stopped vibrating with slow-burn tension. Sloane stood at the center of the grand terrace, her silhouette sharp against the rising Seoul sun. She was no longer dressed in the invisibility by design of a dark maid's uniform. Instead, she wore a structured suit of deep navy silk, a sovereign garment that draped over her shoulders like a legacy forged in iron. She looked down at her wrists, now bare and exposed to the cool morning air. The anatomy of a lie was gone. The scars remained, but they had lost their power to make her shrink. They were no longer fatal details of a victim's history, but the iron-forged evidence of a survivor's physical ascent. She didn't feel the need for long sleeves or the hospital noose of protective vigilance. For the first time since that Tuesday morning escape in London, her breathing was entirely, permanently unburdened. A soft footfall broke the silence, the rhythmic, lethal calm of someone who no longer needed to haunt the shades of gray. Caspian Moon stepped onto the terrace, his chilling pale gray eyes softening as they landed on her. He didn't approach her as a master or a protector, but as a man who had finally found the missing variable in his own anatomy of power. He stood beside her, his presence an iron shield that she no longer needed for survival, but chose for companionship. "The city is quiet today," Caspian murmured, his voice a low vibration of absolute finality. "The shadow behind the curtain has confirmed that the threat has been liquidated. There are no more ghosts, Sloane. Only the future we architect." Sloane turned to him, her wide-eyed exhaustion replaced by the immovable grace of a woman who had reclaimed her sense of self. She reached out, her fingers brushing the sleeve of his coat, not in a lesson in obedience, but in a sovereign alliance. The status collapse of her old life had cleared the ground for this iron coronation, a reality where she was not a ghost, but a pillar. "I spent 3 years running 12,000 kilometers, she said, her voice steady and forged and unbreakable. "I thought solace was a place I had to find. I didn't realize it was a version of myself I had to become." Caspian placed a hand on the small of her back, a gesture of sovereign protection that felt like a homecoming. They stood together, looking out over a city that was no longer a labyrinth of grit and grease, but a canvas for their shared mastery of control. The anatomy of a lie was over. Sloane solace. Vance was not invisible. She was not hiding. She was loved, she was home, and she was finally beautifully herself. As the sun climbed higher, the Iron Architect and his invisible savior descended into the light of the city, moving together toward a reckoning that promised only peace.